You'd think by now I'd be able to say, oh, I know what it is, but I don't want to.
When Paul McCartney walked into Abbey Road Studios with a new song in his head, he knew it wasn't like the others. It wasn't the upbeat melodic pop tune that people had come to expect from him. It wasn't the polished sound George Martin usually admired. It was darker, heavier, and carried a raw edge that McCartney himself wasn't sure would even fit inside the Beatles' catalog. The song was Helter Skelter. At this point in 1968, the Beatles were deep in the recording of the White Album. The sessions had become chaotic, marked by tensions, walkouts, and competing egos. John Lennon was pushing experimental noise and political statements. George Harrison was quietly trying to bring his own material to the table, often getting overlooked. Ringo Starr was so frustrated with the constant fighting that he briefly quit the band altogether. And Paul McCartney, ever determined to lead, was desperate to prove that the Beatles could still outdo everyone else in rock music. What triggered McCartney was a piece he had read about The Who. Reports claimed Pete Townsend and his band had created the loudest, rawest, heaviest song ever recorded. McCartney, competitive to his core, couldn't let that stand. If The Who could do it, the Beatles could do it better. That thought burned in him, and it was the spark behind Helter Skelter. But for McCartney, this wasn't just about proving something to the outside world. It was about testing the limits of what the Beatles could be. The band was already known for innovation, pioneering psychedelic rock, studio experimentation, and concept albums. But heavy rock? That wasn't their territory, at least not yet. McCartney was convinced they could redefine themselves again, and yet deep down, he was nervous. George Martin, the band's producer and often the voice of refinement, had little patience for noise without structure. McCartney worried Martin would dismiss it as chaos, just another messy experiment. The recording of Helter Skelter was unlike anything the Beatles had ever attempted. The sessions were loud, uncontrolled, and exhausting. McCartney screamed the vocals until his voice cracked. Guitars were turned up to maximum distortion. Ringo thrashed his drums with such intensity that his hands blistered. The studio filled with feedback, raw distortion, and a relentless pounding rhythm that seemed to shake the walls. For hours they hammered away at the track, trying to capture the energy McCartney demanded. To many in the studio, it sounded like madness. This wasn't the polished sound of Sgt. Pepper. This wasn't the carefully crafted harmonies of Rubber Soul. This was pure chaos, and McCartney knew Martin might hate it. George Martin had always valued balance, clarity, and sophistication. He admired structure and arrangement, even when the Beatles pushed boundaries. But Helter Skelter was different. It was messy, brutal, and deliberately unrefined. McCartney imagined Martin shaking his head, questioning whether this belonged on a Beatles record at all. Yet McCartney pushed forward. His determination was relentless. He didn't just want to record the song, he wanted to make it sound dangerous. He wanted listeners to feel overwhelmed by its sheer force. And in doing so, he wasn't just competing with The Who, he was laying the groundwork for something bigger. Decades later, critics would point to Helter Skelter as one of the first true heavy metal songs, influencing bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and countless others. But in the moment inside Abbey Road, all that mattered was the tension. Lennon was unimpressed by McCartney's attempt at heaviness. To him, it felt like Paul was once again trying to dominate, to prove he could outshine everyone else. Harrison gave his best on guitar but remained sidelined, his own compositions often ignored in favor of Lennon-McCartney material. Ringo, caught in the middle, played with aggression but also with growing frustration at the endless arguments. By the time the final version of Helter Skelter was completed, the studio was drained. McCartney had achieved what he wanted, a track so loud and intense that it sounded like nothing else the Beatles had ever recorded. But the cost was another step toward the band's unraveling. What McCartney feared, that George Martin would dismiss the track as junk, didn't happen outright, but Martin was far from enthusiastic. He tolerated it, understanding that the Beatles were determined to explore every extreme. Yet his restrained reaction only confirmed McCartney's worry. Helter Skelter wasn't the kind of music Martin loved. And still, McCartney's gamble paid off. When the White Album was released, Helter Skelter stood out as one of its most shocking moments. Critics were divided. Some called it brilliant, a revolutionary step toward heavier rock. Others dismissed it as noise, proof that the Beatles had lost their direction. But either way, it got people talking. And that was exactly what McCartney wanted. In the years since, the song has taken on a life of its own. Infamously, it was misinterpreted by Charles Manson, who twisted its meaning into a symbol for violence and chaos. That dark association would forever haunt the track, cementing its place in history as one of the Beatles' most controversial creations. For McCartney, though, Helter Skelter was about something else entirely. It was about pushing boundaries, silencing critics, and proving that the Beatles could be heavier, louder, and more dangerous than anyone expected. It was a statement of power, and even if he worried that George Martin would hate it, McCartney's instincts were right. The song became a cornerstone of rock history. The story of Helter Skelter captures everything about the Beatles in 1968. The ambition, the competitiveness, the chaos, and the cracks forming between them. It was a moment when McCartney's drive clashed with Martin's refinement, when Lennon and Harrison's resentment boiled beneath the surface, and when Ringo nearly walked away for good. All of it wrapped into one explosive recording. Paul McCartney might have been worried, but in chasing that fear, he created something unforgettable. Helter Skelter wasn't just another Beatles song. It was the sound of a band tearing itself apart, and at the same time shaping the future of rock.